was very, very good. I came in with modest expectations. I knew the action would be good. I knew The Rock would be good. But besides that, I was like, I'm open to criticisms that it may not be all that good after that. Nope. I thought for the most part, I want to be very careful here. In terms of percentages, most of the running time was well spent. It's mostly well done. The action scenes were efficiently done. The acting overall was very strong. Like there was never a weak performance anywhere. Like even the villain character, supporting cast, key members of the GSA, nobody was slacking here. Some of the jokes worked, some of them did not. But overall, yeah, this was a pretty good film. I'm not getting why people think it's such a bad film. It's not a bad film. This is legit, not just a good film. It's not great, but it's sort of in the weird category of very good to almost great. Very close, but doesn't quite get there. Not due to any one major dilemma. There are two things that will stick out as kind of problems that I had, which I think probably dragged down the score. But mainly it's these minor little flaws that kind of keep accumulating and that will drag down the score. So, what is the story? Well, essentially, Black Adam was a magical entity who was made a champion to take on this very tyrannical ruler. That was thousands of years ago, but he's awoken today to take on a new threat facing Kandok, which is this kind of weird city slash country slash kingdom. It seems to be vaguely located in the Middle East. So it's unclear where Kandok is, and a lot of the plot is vague because apparently they're being occupied by Intergang, this very ruthless criminal organization, and they're exploiting the resources. What are these resources? Don't know. Intergang are properly vicious. They're very generic brutes, but what is their agenda? It's kind of a twist at the end, but you're like, okay, but what were they doing before that? It's not clear. So it's a lot of question marks with the world building. So Kandok is well shot. It does look great, but it's kind of just a very generic big city. There are a few monuments that make it stick out. Beyond that, it's like it's a very well shot, large, Middle Eastern esque city. That's about it. They did give you lore details, but they don't go much back to them. So, what is Kandok really? It's not really clear. It's just a place he protects from foreigners. That's about it. Then we get to the really major problem: is the villain is extremely generic. When they finally reveal who the big bad is, you're like, okay, that is the big bad. And the design of the big bad is not terrible, but when this ferocious supervillain emerges, you're like, okay, right. It's not that it was predictable. I think the twist was fine, but when they give the villain, it's like it's not very impressive, and the motivations are really generic. Those are the major weaknesses that the antagonist and even the main opposing force are just very plain and boring, and they're not very intelligent because the goons keep shooting Black Adam. He does have limits. We see early on he can be injured, but bullets really will not affect him very much. So why they keep shooting him, don't know. So the real standouts here will, of course, be the JSA in the way they interact with Black Adam. That is a lot of the film, so most of the film is pretty good to maintain consistency. And the people who really stood out are, of course, not just The Rock, but Fate. Pierce Brosnan does a lot for this film, even though technically he's not in the film all that much. Don't worry, he's a lot in the film, but in terms of raw screen time, really, it is The Rock, but he plays a very critical character, and I don't want to give too much weight because he has a very calm demeanor. That's very critical to certain twists, and very much appreciated because Hawkman gets into a kind of alpha dog versus alpha dog dynamic with The Rock. They trade blows. The action scenes are fine, but their dynamic is fairly limited until the very end, where it gets a little bit more dynamic. The only one who really gets lost in the mix is kind of Adam Smasher. The actor is fine. He does a little bit of comedy relief. I think he's very impressive, but he kind of gets the short end of the stick. Cyclone, we get a little bit more about her and her origin, but the only problem is with her, it's the same thing. It's not that the actress was bad or the character is bad, but her powers are just kind of, they just keep repeating the same CGI shots over and over and over again, and that's it. When you see it three more times, you're like, oh wow, that's all they have with her. Just the CGI shots with her in particular really went nowhere. But for everyone else, yeah, this is pretty well done. The performances were pretty strong. CGI was really solid for the most part. There are a few flaws here and there. There are even places where the CGI was very impressive and very detailed. People are not noting that. So the CGI was actually very impressive. But we can't get away from this is a very conventional story. It is an origin story. I think people need to take that seriously. It's an origin story, so we're getting introduced to everything for the first time. and they're gonna lay it out there. And I guess some people just weren't interested in that. But I'm sort of intermediate with Black Adam. I know a little bit, but not that much. So I was gobbling everything. So it was very interesting. I was very engaged. But I would say the choice of style and choice of framing of certain shots, even some conventional musical cues were a little bit too on the nose and they were a little bit too predictable. And some of the plot twists I could predict safely, but some of them I did not predict. The script was mainly pretty solid, but I will say this, the rest of the supporting cast is kind of forgettable. I looked them up before I did this review, but I want to be honest, I didn't really remember who the lady archaeologist was. I kind of remember the kid, and except for a few cringe points of dialogue, he was actually pretty good. But I kind of remember him because they say his name all the time in the film, so I know Amon. But the other people, who the brother was, he was not a bad actor, just forgot about him. The main source of the attraction will be, yes, The Rock, Fate, played by Pierce Brosnan, and the other members of the JSA. Their dynamic's fine. It does dominate most of the film, so most of the film is pretty good. But when they get to the other areas, like concentrating on the villains or the plot twists with the villains, they pose enough interesting thematic questions between being a villain versus being a hero versus being a champion. Again, it's nothing really mind-blowingly great, but for the story they're telling, this is a very well done film. It's mostly pretty good in most areas, but there are little flaws that do accumulate. Nothing too bad, but yeah, the major problem is the opposing force and villain are just kind of ho hum, not really that interesting. The action scenes are well done, and the CGI is very well done at the end. It's not sloppy CGI with the battle at the end, but it just feels like the characters just they didn't really put an effort to make it, unique design or even unique motivation. So I'm forced to give this. Again, I think people would be shocked. This is a severe grade, but I'm going to give this an 8.35. It's a very good film. Don't believe the critics. This is not at all a bad film, but there is a lot of predictability and a lot of little flaws that keep coming up that do drag the score down. But overall, it's a very strong film, especially for an origin story. Never boring. Perhaps zipped by a little bit too fast. They could have done better by pacing it a little slower and adding a few more key scenes at certain points. That's about it. So a few little flaws, but overall a very good cinematic experience. Don't deny yourself. Please see Black Adam.